Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown. This is Nicholas Capman with the FDA Group. Before we jump into our discussion for today, just a little bit about the FDA Group. We help life science companies in the areas of quality assurance, regulatory affairs, clinical operations, commissioning, qualification, and validation, as well as pharmacovigilance. We offer three different engagement models, which are consulting, staff augmentation, and full-time employee recruitment. So, if you ever find yourself in need, just head over to the fdagroup.com to check us out and get in touch. So today I am talking with Dr. Stapff. Hello, Dr. Stapff. Thank you for joining.
Hello, Nicholas. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, excellent. So before we jump into the topic for today, would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, as Nicholas said, my name is Manfred Stapff. I'm a physician by training, started treating patients for about 4 or 5 years until my interest drove me to research, mainly drug development, but I also did medical services and other stuff which you can do as a physician in the pharmaceutical industry. And a few years ago, uh, my career brought me to real world evidence, meaning to real world data. And I was so impressed by the possibility to analyze actual data, electronic medical records, claims data, and other data to answer unanswered questions in medicine that I stayed a little bit more intensive with this area. And that's why we are sitting here today talking about real world evidence, what it can do, what it cannot do. And this also kind of leads into daily life, not only in medical research, but also in daily life. We have to do with evidence, we have to do with information, with fake news, with misinformation, and some methods which we use in real world evidence for medical research can also be applied to daily life or even in politics to make sure that decision making is really based on facts, on data as much as possible.
Okay, great. Well, that was a good sequitur into the topic for today. So, let's start with the definition of what exactly real world evidence is. How would you define it?
Real world evidence, it's interesting. I find it a little bit funny even, but if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Real world data is everything what does not come from an experimental situation, does not come from a clinical trial, does not come from a carefully planned and scheduled registry. It comes from the day-to-day interaction, from the day-to-day medicine interaction between physicians and patients. Uh, when we talk about medicine, when we talk about other areas, real world data come from the street drivers for the investigation of cars, gasoline consumption, or other situations where we want to have analysis and knowledge gain using data. So real world data come always from a situation which is not influenced by any kind of scientific protocol, by any kind of schedule, by any kind of interaction. And this includes, for example, also the informed consent process. Just with the informed consent process, we are slightly interfering into how patients behave. People behave differently when they know that they are observed. That's the so-called Hawthorne effect. And we also know in clinical development the placebo effect. So real world data come from the real world, not from any kind of experimental scientific interference.
Okay.
And real world data become real world evidence if they collected in high quality, if they're analyzed with statistically correct methods, if the analysis is interpreted within the frame of the original hypothesis, and if the interpretation is then communicated in a correct way so that the audience can understand it, because this is also a difference whether you talk to your colleagues or to a group of professors, or whether you talk to patients, or whether you talk to caregivers. So also the communication is a relatively important point of the long real world evidence process.
Okay. So what I'd like to ask is, um, whom in this audience will benefit the most from this conversation, and what do you hope by the end of this conversation that they will learn and be able to implement?
Yeah, so your audience is perhaps mainly the group who works professionally in drug development, works in clinical development, works perhaps also in medical services, meaning everything what is the big category of medical research. Can be efficacy and safety of drugs, can also be a long-term effect or outcomes trials, can be scientific data with supported development of treatment recommendations. I think this is mainly your audience, the audience of the FDA group. The name already tells where we're going. Uh, I also think that these methods, which we are talking about in medical research, can easily be applied to daily life, even to politics. As I said earlier in the introduction, every day we are bombarded with information by TV stations, by cable TV, by social media. Every post on social media has a little bit of an information, has perhaps a misinformation, a fake news, has perhaps a disinformation. And as a consumer of this information, we also have to analyze that. We have to check, where does it come from? What is the source? Is it real world data, or is it already evidence? What's the difference between data and evidence? What do we need to know to actually believe it? So the audience for the overall topic real world evidence is certainly wider than those who work in the pharmaceutical or biotech industry in drug development, despite the term kind of suggests that this was most likely the area who was thinking about real world evidence the first. I think the term comes from the pharmaceutical industry, but it can be applied to many situations in daily life.
Hmm. When I think about some of the things that real world evidence isn't, you mentioned clinical trial protocols, and I understand what you're saying about the Hawthorne effect, although I'm also understanding that when questions are developed, they're usually written in a manner that is uh, promoting the end goal of getting the most accurate information possible. So, as we're talking about real world data that turns into real world evidence, the skeptic in me says, how do I know I can trust it? And perhaps you could give me some examples of real world data that is something that we should be wary of. And then what is an example of real world data where we can feel confidence?
It's really a very important question, because it's always the question, can we trust that? Can we trust statistics? Can we trust randomized clinical trials? Can we trust real world data? And it's not automatically that you have to mistrust real world and automatically you have to trust randomized clinical trials, RCTs. Currently, RCTs are still considered the gold standard to prove efficacy and safety of a drug, but we also have to know their disadvantages. And the same is for real world data. Currently, real world data are sometimes mistrusted because they may be incomplete, they may be upcoded for billing purposes, there may be just typos, errors, decimal point errors, because there's no source data control in real world data usually. So both have their pros and cons, and you have to know both. And I can tell you immediately there will be no winner. We will not say that only RCTs are trustworthy or only real world data represent the real world and only those you can believe in. Both have their quality standards which need to be maintained, and both have sometimes their flaws. So in clinical trials, we know the flaws. We have usually a handful of inclusion criteria, 20, 30 exclusion criteria. So the population in a clinical trial is optimized and selected for those populations who show the best efficacy and show the best safety. Optimizing it for safety makes sense if a drug is in phase 2 and phase 3 and we don't really know their side effects. We really want to exclude elderly people, other risk people, pregnant people, lactating people. This is the standard which we exclude. But there are many other exclusion criteria just for the sake of the mechanism of action, just for the sake of showing the outcome criteria in the clearest way. So the consequence is obvious that the results or the population of clinical trials are sometimes not really well representing the population who is supposed to take the drug later when it comes to the market. It became even a little bit politicized with the diversity and inclusion discussion. It's absolutely clear that clinical trial population is more male, more white people, more younger people. And as I said earlier, also risk peoples are excluded. Also, trial participants have usually a higher socioeconomic and educational standard than the general population with this disease. So the representativity is really a question which we have to have in mind when we try to trust clinical trial results. When we go to real world data, we assume, oh, this comes now from real world. This comes now from unselected population. But also in order to analyze it correctly, we have to check for completeness and we have to exclude data sets. We do not have the data which we need to define the disease or which we need to measure the outcomes criteria, or we want to have a long-term outcome. And of course, in the real world, you do not always stay to the same doctor over many, many years. So if you do not have some linking of data sources, then you have to exclude those patients. For them, you do not have the long-term data. So there's also a selection effect. And then there's the quality effect. Real world data need to have a quality assurance. Every data company which brokers real world data must have a quality system where the data are checked for completeness, for plausibility. Just to give you one example, if in a data set, if there are treatments for thyroid function, then there should be also a thyroid-related diagnosis and a thyroid-related laboratory value. Otherwise, the data set is incomplete and it may be falsely leading into a conclusion which goes into the wrong way. So RCT, randomized clinical trial, real world evidence, nobody is the winner and nobody is the only one who you can trust. They complement each other. You have an experiment, a scientific study, which comes up with a result, and then this result has to prove in real world that it goes into the same direction. The results don't have to have exactly identical because the population is identical. The way how you do these treatments, the study protocols, the visits, and so on are not identical. But the result and the overall conclusion should go into the same direction. That drug A is better than drug B in the randomized clinical trial, but it should also show that drug A is better than drug B in the real world data. So no winner, no competition between these two methods, but complementation between these two methods.
Let's say I'm capturing some real world data. Um, will the FDA be accepting of that data and that evidence?
They will, and they have done. Obviously, there's not too much real world data about a new new chemical entity, which is in phase 2 and phase 3, and it's not on the market. So then you don't have real world data. You can only have study data. But there are drugs on the market which have an indication and are partially used for other indications off label or for modified indications. And from these cases, one can certainly take the real world data. And it happened when it came to new indications. In some cases, the FDA accepted real world data for a new indication of an already marketed drug. One classical example is a special aortic valve procedure in the medical device area. Another is a certain indication for tacrolimus, which is on the market since many, many, many years, for a modification, a certain group of patients with a certain pre-therapy. So real world data are accepted by the FDA, always provided the raw data, the real world data are of good quality. There are data quality procedures set up, and also the analysis are following proper methods. And one other very important part where the FDA is certainly accepting real world data and even collecting themselves real world data with the so-called Sentinel system is pharmacovigilance. So here you have real world, you have the product on the market, you can collect or select populations who take this, you have long-term data, and you can certainly then analyze what type of side effects or potential adverse events, adverse diagnosis appear during the time and can analyze them, perhaps even compare them with a population who has similar risk factors, similar diseases, similar demography, but is not taking this drug to see whether it's actually related to the taking of the drug or it may be more related to the population. We have done this for finasteride with the always important question, finasteride and prostate cancer. Is there a relationship? And also finasteride and sexual dysfunction, and also finasteride and depression and suicidality. So these are very interesting and very important questions which can be solved by long-term real-world data, and obviously are also taken by the regulatory authorities if they come from trustworthy sources and are analyzed correctly.
If I'm seeing real world data and I want to use it to, for example, add a new indication to a marketed product, would it make sense for myself to approach the FDA to confirm that the data that I am capturing and analyzing will be accepted?
Like in any regulatory procedures, it always helps to proactively interact with the FDA and share with them what you plan to do. And in many, many cases, very interesting and productive discussion comes out of that. And this applies also to real world data, or especially to real world data. The FDA is just, as we all know, in the process of getting a little bit shuffled, reorganized, and we will see how this works out and how the integration of real world data and clinical trial data will happen there, because there are certainly coordinative efforts there, whether it goes a little bit more by therapeutic area or more by method, whether it will be within CEDAR or will be a separate department or a separate division. We will see how this goes out, but I always favor, of course, proactive discussion with the FDA if it's possible, if you can have that, if they have time for you. and then work out together what you plan to analyze, what you plan to do. The advantage for real world data is everything can happen relatively quickly because you do not necessarily have to wait 6 months, 12 months, 18 months until the study is enrolled, and then another perhaps 1 year or 2 years of the treatment duration. So you're not talking about years until you have the results of the study. You are talking perhaps about weeks if you have to do the concept, see the data source, collect the data or download the data and then analyze them. So real world evidence obviously has the advantage of an enormous shortening of the period from hypothesis to result and basically publication.
One place that I'm thinking is a place to go to get real world data is the AIRS database. What is your opinion on self-reported information, specifically with the AIRS database? And where are some other sources that you would caution people to stay away from and encourage people to trust?
So this is, of course, very important. The data, where do they come from? I mentioned earlier the classical real-world data source is electronic medical records, usually ICD codes for diagnosis, other codes for laboratory and medication. They can be considered relatively reliable, except perhaps incomplete documentation or the notorious upcoding. I have no data or no proof how often it happens, but one has to be at least one has to be alert that this may happen. Self-reported data, patient questionnaires, is relatively important to consider in the context of diagnosis. What do you really want to collect? What type of data? If it's, for example, a questionnaire in rheumatology about ankle pain, mobility, and this kind of things, these are relatively objective data which the patient know because patients used to know a lot about their disease. There is definitely a subjective factor. There is definitely also something like questionnaire tiredness, which one has to consider over the long term. If you have to fill out the same questionnaire, these days you don't fill out a questionnaire anymore, you tip it in your smartphone. But still you can get questionnaire tiredness. It has been shown recently that questionnaires or self-reported data which are related to nutrition. Did you eat? How much did you eat? When did you eat? How much carbs? How much fat? How much protein did you eat? That they systematically underestimate what actually is being consumed. How can one find that? One can calculate based on what the patients report, how much this would approximately convert into calories, and you compare that to what a human normally needs, the basic calories, which are often between 1,500 and 2,200 calories. And then you see that this cannot match up. You need more calories just to exist, to work, to do your daily job or your daily activities. You need more calories than you admit in the questionnaire. So many of these questionnaire-based nutrition studies are sometimes questioned because of the reliability of the patient recorded or patient reported data. We also have to consider that if you have patient reported data, you already have a little bit of a Hawthorne effect. You have already a little bit of an experimental situation. The patient know that they are part of a scientific study, even with a registry, even if the registry data supposedly come from the real world. they come from a scientific environment. So there is already a little bit of Hawthorne effect and placebo effect and simple honesty, what the patient report in their questionnaire is to be considered. But there's no better way. This goes back even to uh, Heisenberg's uncertainty theory, who says that science is never 100% correct. You cannot measure the point location of an object and the speed at the same time with 100% certainty, which is basically the typical example. As soon as you measure something, you interfere into its nature. And this is also something which we have to have somehow in the back of our mind, that 100% exactness in research or science is most likely an unachievable goal.
Hence the reason for statistical significance. Um, I want to move into the category of artificial intelligence. However, before we move into that world, is there anything else that's relevant to this current discussion that you want to add before we transition?
Yeah, I want to mention two statistical terms since you mentioned it, and it's actually good because it kind of uh, reminded me to say something about it. The statistical significance, and everybody who works in the clinical development, in interpreting and analyzing clinical studies, I think knows it. But the general population is sometimes too much impressed by the word statistical significant because it says to them, oh, that's true. What is true is that statistically, yes, it's true. This results of a, let's say, minor difference is most likely not by incidence, but most likely a real difference. Statisticians may hate if I simplify it, but if I say 95% probability, that's the P 5%, 95% probability this results is for real and not by incidence, so you can believe it. And we work all with 95% in research. We never work with 100%. But this is only the statistical point, only the mathematical point. If you have a huge sample size, you can always get minuscule differences to statistical significance. And then that's the point where physicians have to be asked, is this even clinically relevant from a medical point of view for the patient? Would you change the therapy because of such a small difference? And this is really important when it comes to long-term survival studies, when it comes to diabetes studies, when it comes to small differences, hemoglobin A1C, and all these questions where we find small differences statistically significant. We use this huge, important word, statistically significant. Yes, from a methodological point of view, correct. But the medical view also needs to be brought into the discussion. So yeah, this is the statistical significance in just one sentence. Correlation, whether causality is also a point. Perhaps we cannot spend too much time on that today, but the fact that two populations or two data sets change at the same time does not automatically mean there's a causality between them. You have
Right.
to prove that.
Yeah, I was just going to
And this
say,
is, yeah,
it doesn't always measure causality. It could just be correlational.
exactly.
And if you weren't able to get all of the statisticians upset yet, we also know the phrase "there are lies, damn lies in statistics," right? So, yet another reason why we have to be very, very critical about the data that we're looking at and using it as evidence because there are a lot of things that may correlate that don't have a causational relationship.
It's absolutely true. Absolutely true. It's very often misunderstood. even in the professional world, even in peer-reviewed journals, I see sometimes uh, the issue of not considering clinical relevance and only considering statistically significant. And I also see the mix-up of causality and correlation. And the general population obviously cannot have the deep knowledge to uh, critically question when they are told, oh, this increased during that time and that increased during that time. So that's proof that this causes that one. We have a correlation between the population of storks and the population of people in Germany in the 1970s. I leave it to the audience to make their conclusion.
Very, very fair, very fair. Okay, so artificial intelligence. I don't think we've reached the point of being cliche yet, because there's still so much to discover in the world of artificial intelligence. But let's jump into that. So, what is the relationship between real world data and artificial intelligence? Can we begin there?
Yeah, so artificial intelligence obviously is the trendy buzzword these days. And therefore, we have to be careful and have to really differentiate where can AI actually help and where is AI perhaps even dangerous. And this is not that easy. It's not that easy, especially if you don't know and are not very much familiar with how does artificial intelligence actually work? How are the data trained? How are the data used? And where do they come from? I see in the combination with real world evidence, I see some advantage if it's used carefully to interpret masses of data and look for patterns which a human person or a doctor would not easily identify. Uh, we physicians, we have our way to look at the laboratory values, to look at the patient, to look at our own knowledge, and to interpret certain patterns, which lead us to a diagnosis. But AI can, within seconds, screen millions of data, millions of patients, and also area where a physician would not even have thought about it. A patient comes because of a torn ankle to an emergency room. And of course, the physician will focus on the bone and on the leg and on the ankle and will not look at all laboratory values, at all symptoms, at the whole patient's history. And if the physician would do that, would take days just to the patient would just come for a broken ankle. Artificial intelligence can do that. And actually, a group of MIT and a hospital in Boston have, with AI, have found patterns in the big overall patient information where certain patterns showed a clear risk of pancreatic cancer and could basically make the diagnosis of pancreatic cancer approximately 1 year before such a patient was actually normally or clinically diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And we know in certain cancers like pancreatitis, an early diagnosis is so important because it gives a real chance of a curative treatment. So this is the point where I see the most value, identifying patterns in the chaos of millions and billions of data points and see a pattern which predicts a disease or explains a disease. Why do some patients who get infected with COVID, why do some people or did some people die? And why others have only minor symptoms? We really don't know. We know the classical risk spectrum. If you smoke, you are at risk. Uh, If you have high hypertension, you're at risk. If you diabetes, have risk. These are the classical. But in the billions of bytes and bits of a patient information, there may be other patterns which we have not even remotely thought about. So that's number one of AI for me.
Yeah,
Other things where AI basically writes some statements, or the most stupid way of using AI is just to take what ChatGPT prints, takes it, copies, and paste it into a legal case, or paste it into an abstract, or paste it into a publication. Uh, I would say this is artificial stupidity and not artificial intelligence.
sure. Now, one of the things you mentioned, which hadn't crossed my mind, is I was thinking about your example about the broken ankle. And if I used AI, I would, my mind initially went to, we're looking at a patient population that's very similar to this patient. And if we evaluate all of the data that's out there using AI, we can see that this dietary aspect of that population is causing osteoporosis, which is leading to broken ankles, right? So that's initially where my mind went. Then
Mhm.
you talked about the pancreatic cancer diagnosis a year ahead of when it can happen. So I'm really fascinated and wondering what information you have today about what seems to be a very new world of a case use of artificial intelligence where it's not necessarily analyzing populations, it's predicting future illnesses and diagnoses based off of data. So, could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, AI cannot predict the future. AI can look at the past. This may be past prescriptions, past diseases, past laboratory values, and what is, let's say, today. And if they compare, let's say, hundreds of thousands of patients with a look of their past, prescriptions, data, laboratory values, medical incidents, etc. And they find then that a certain percentage has a certain disease or a certain diagnosis now, and they have some similarities in their past, and their past can go back to the genetics, which perhaps is one of the biggest secrets in medicine, which we still have to solve. Uh, then AI makes their conclusion. So AI can, of course, not predict the future. AI can only analyze the information which it has. And you know the old sentence, garbage in, garbage out. And this also applies to AI. Where does AI have their information? When we talk about medical data, we all understand where there may be the advantages and where may be the risks, and where do we have to be careful, because we know how to deal with laboratory values, diagnosis, and this kind of thing in epidemiology. But when it comes to other areas, which is more political, which is more emotional, then of course what AI does, it carries over the bias into its results, because it can only analyze and learn from what AI finds in the internet, in the social media. And if the whole internet is racist, I'm just exaggerating, if the whole social media is racist, then AI will also be racist. Or coming back to medicine, if the AI is analyzing hundreds of millions of medical data, then of course it can only be as exact as the data. So if the data uh, are biased, or the data have a bad quality, the AI outcomes would also be biased. It's classical if you use clinical trial data. Companies take their clinical trial data. They have, of course, also thousands of patients if they are doing drug development for many, many, many years. They have thousands of data coming from their clinical trials. If they run this data through AI, then they, of course, have the same kind of randomized clinical trial way of looking at the data with the bias, with the lack of representativity, with the optimization for safety and efficacy. You cannot run AI on clinical trial data and then expect that you get a real world evidence result. Clinical trial data represent what happens in a clinical trial. Real world data represent what comes out of real world and daily medical practice. So there are many things one should be aware of and careful. But in general, of course, only if you deal with AI, only if you use it, only if you are careful, you learn how to correctly apply AI for your specific hypothesis, for your specific question. So it's definitely not AI is bad or AI is super. That's the modern way to go. Now you have to apply it reasonably.
Right. Now, a few things. First is I see an opportunity for a new level of preventative care using AI. I think that could be a possibility. And um, my opinion is while it can be abused, such as anything and everything can be abused, I think there's a good opportunity for insurance companies to be a bit more stable and possibly profitable long term or the extension of life beyond wherever it is today. And then the reduced need for uh, medications to address the diagnoses after they've happened. So I see that. The other thing is AI is not done yet, right? So we understand the issues with ChatGPT. We also understand the issues with the information that's on the internet. What I have seen is that you can use the structure, the skeletal structure of ChatGPT or any other GPT, and you can feed it with information that can not eliminate bias, but severely and significantly reduce the amount of bias. So I think that's where if people go on the internet and start searching for AI solutions, there's a whole bunch of different um, systems that are out there that people have never heard of, and then the next question might be, well, why would I want to use that if I can just use ChatGPT for everything? Well, you can't use ChatGPT for everything. That's the reason you have these different solutions because they've taken that structure, that skeleton of ChatGPT, and they've said, okay, what can't ChatGPT do right now? And why can't it do it? So now that I understand what it can't do and why it can't do it, I now can teach it to be aware of some of those pitfalls that can come from a non-programmable GPT.
Yeah, important point. The first thing you mentioned it, use more than one AI source, not only always ChatGPT. And if it's just ChatGPT and Google AI, there's already a little bit of diversity in it. I experienced it myself when I tested the quality of ChatGPT and asked exactly the same question 4 times in a row. And normally you would expect proof of reliability. When you ask 4 times the same question, you should 4 times get the same results. Like if you have a thermometer which is reliable, if you measure 4 times in the same environment, you get 4 times the same degree. Today is perhaps in New York, it's in the area of 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So we all know that. Uh, when I did this test, I get 4 times different answers. And also with the, let's say, authoritative language of ChatGPT, very nice, very friendly. Oh, I will be glad to answer your question. The question you ask is, and I can tell you this was so. We all know this kind of very nice language of ChatGPT. It's impressive for me because I'm not an English language speaker, so it's really kind of speaking like authority. Ask the same question, Google, get one answer, and it was the right one. So use more than one source. And you also measured, yeah, we have to program ChatGPT, we have to cheat ChatGPT. This is the human factor where bias or mistakes can happen. Where does the programming come from? Where does the training come from? Which data set has been used for the training? This is also another reason to use a variety of AI sources and not only one. So again, AI is not free of mistakes, not free of bias, not free of discrimination, or even not free of racism. AI is in this way actually almost acting like a human, just much, much, much faster and based on much, much, much more information. But if a human is continuously only reading one set of newspapers or is only watching one set of social media or is only watching one part of the spectrum of TV, cable TV news, then the human will also be biased, and so can be AI.
I also would say I don't know that ChatGPT has reached or other GPTs have reached the level yet where it can disseminate bad information. So to your point, if I'm looking at different media outlets, I know certain ones are more trustworthy than other ones, and so it doesn't necessarily mean that I can't use other sources, but perhaps I need to measure the amount of confidence that I have within that article in a way that is consistent with the level of accuracy of that outlet, right?
Yeah,
And obviously utilizing other media to determine whether or not that particular opinion is worth believing and having confidence in or not.
yeah.
Um, so this has been a really, really good podcast in terms of talking about what is real world data, what is real world evidence, what does it all mean, how can AI help, but what do you need to watch out for? So as we close, what would you like to leave the audience with?
So this was really a very enjoyable 1 hour and very interesting. And thank you for having me and also for challenging the whole topic with very smart and intelligent questions. Just to summarize, I think, and I don't want to overstretch the audience's kind of uh, capacity of memorizing the conclusions. I think the first thing is randomized clinical trials and real world evidence do not compete but complement each other. So, RFK Jr. is currently searching for the new gold standard in science. I think the combination of scientific experiment and real world data and the results allow the same conclusions and go in the same direction. This should be the newest gold standard in science, whether it's the development of drugs, whether it's the safety of vaccines, whether it's the impact of electric vehicles to the environment. All these things have an experimental part and a real world part, and they should go together in the same direction as the new gold standard. So this is number one. And number two is more a little bit to the general audience. If you read something, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or X or Truth Social, and it contains some facts, just remember that there are facts. And when facts are repeated by others, that means that the others believe in that, but it does not mean that this is true. It needs a scientific hypothesis. Why could this happen? Why could a disease happen? What would be the mechanism of action? disease, let's say 4 weeks after vaccination. It needs a scientifically plausible hypothesis. Whether it's then true or not will then be proven by a scientific experiment. And then the result of the scientific experiment has to prove that it actually happens also in real world. So keep in mind this kind of gradual strength of knowledge gain, this gradual strength of evidence from a rumor, a post in social media, which basically has no evidential value because just someone says it. But if many people say it, if there's a scientific hypothesis, if there's an experiment, if the experiment has proven itself also in real world data, then you have evidence. So we all as citizens have to apply this thinking when we hear things. And we had so many discussions about danger to democracy. The danger to democracy is less coming from Washington or from politicians. It's also coming from us as the citizen. If we are not educated enough, smart enough to actually judge whether informations which we get can be true or can be misleading or just want to manipulate us. It's on us to keep democracy alive and be educated citizens and knowledgeable voters.
Okay, well, Mr. Stapff, Dr. Stapff, thank you very much for your insight. I really appreciate it. Excuse me. And as always, for everybody listening, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you haven't already, subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn. If you'd like to connect about project or resource needs, head over to thefdagroup.com to get in touch, or feel free to connect with me personally on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you all next time.
And buy this book, Real World Evidence Unveiled, How to Deal with Misinformation. A little bit of promotion should be allowed. Thank you very much. Thank you.